And so we'll kick us off, like I mentioned, with our keynote presenter, Dr. Marshall Shepard. We're really happy to have him here. So just a brief bio here. So Dr. Marshall Shepard is the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Georgia. Among his many awards and recognitions of excellence, Dr. Shepard is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the first UGA faculty member in history to achieve that trifecta and is the first African-American to do so as well. Dr. Shepard is recognized as an expert climate scientist and climate communicator worldwide. He is the host of the Weather Channel's award-winning show Weather Geeks and is a frequent expert on weather, climate, remote sensing, and has appeared on national media, including CBS Face the Nation, Today Show, Fox News, and the Weather Channel, among others. So today we're really excited to hear Dr. Shepard speak on climate change, climate communication, and environmental justice. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Marshall Shepard.
Brent, thank you so much for the invite. When I got your email, I was really intrigued about this opportunity because I wanted to learn more about who you were. And so I'm happy to share with you all this morning some thoughts. So let me attempt to share my screen and let's see if it looks okay. This may take a couple of iterations. And while I'm doing that, if you want to follow along in Twitter and tweet out things that I'm talking about, I'm at Dr. Shepard 2013. That's Dr. Shepard, SHEPHERD. Happy to have you join me because I keep a lot of these issues in my Twitter feed quite often on a daily basis. So let's go ahead and try to share the screen and see if that works. Okay, so is it full screen?
Yes, it is.
Very good. Okay, good, because that's not always the case. So I titled this talk, A Conversation About Climate from Multiple Lenses. And essentially, when I talked to Trent, he asked me to talk a little bit about environmental and climate justice, and if I would also talk about some aspects of communicating climate science. And so given the type of audience and your responsibilities, I thought that was a perfect opportunity to kind of essentially blend two talks that I often give together. And so the first part of the discussion will really focus on environmental justice, climate justice. And I actually think of the two somewhat differently. I'll hopefully say a little bit more about that later. And if not, please ask me about it in the Q&A, because I actually do view climate justice and environmental justice as related but different. There's some that agree with me on that and some that disagree with me on that. So the first part will focus on that topic, and the second part will focus on climate communication. There are all of my coordinates, including my Twitter handle and some of the things that I do. Let me just briefly explain this Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor, because I get people that ask me about that. I am actually on Georgia's Athletic Association board, but that's not related to that. The Georgia Athletic Association, which is our parent athletic organization, is very profitable athletic association relative to many around the nation. And so they give quite a significant contribution back to the university every year. And part of that is a couple of endowed professorships, in the same way that you might have the IBM endowed professor of computer science. The Athletic Association actually has a couple of endowed professorships for some of its, high-performing professors. And so that's what that is. So I still host Weather Geeks for the Weather Channel. We do it as a podcast now. Some of you may actually remember it as a TV show as well. And I'm a senior contributor to Forbes magazine. So you see here something that I'll show and probably not show again in the talk, but this is just some of the typical discussion that you often see in the media now about 2020 being this second warmest or third warmest, or we've broken a record for warming, or this is the latest trend. And I show that for context, but I think the discussion about climate change, climate impacts, climate vulnerability, risk, justice, and so forth needs to mature beyond that discussion. And that's one of the things that you'll often hear me probably borderline rant about from time to time on Twitter. So again, sort of a statement to just set the stage. I think this is an audience that certainly understands this, and I'm preaching to the choir. So just for completeness, I have it in there. Climate is changing. The signs are around us. Of course, the climate changes naturally, but there's an anthropogenic signal on top of it. Many of you particularly in the extension world with some of your stakeholders and practitioner audience probably have heard the question, well, what do you mean climate is changing? It always changed. Doesn't climate change naturally? We've always had hurricane, drought, and flood. Well, of course we do. But one of the things that I often try to remind people that is not an and or proposition. It's simply an and proposition. It's not naturally varying climate change or anthropogenic climate change. It's both. Grass grows naturally, but when we fertilize the soil, it grows differently. So there's a combination of natural and anthropogenic processes. I often joke when someone says that climate change is a hoax, because there's naturally varying climate. I said, well, trees fall naturally in the forest too, but that doesn't mean chainsaws aren't hoaxes. We can still cut them down. And so we have to sort of shatter this narrative that it's an or, it's and in terms of what's happening with our climate. So, just before the pandemic, I was invited to testify before the House Science Committee on Capitol Hill. And one of the things that I emphasized in that testimony is that extremes are becoming more extreme and people feel them far more than averages. And this is a part of that narrative that I've tried to insert into the public discourse, which is, yeah, we as scientists think about medians and averages and sort of the statistical properties of the atmosphere, which we define as climate. But what people feel, what businesses feel, what the military feels, what our infrastructure feels is those extremes. And so this is something important for us to understand when we're talking about even climate justice issues or environmental justice issues or trying to communicate the topic. Just to emphasize that point, this is NOAA sort of information showing the 2020 billion dollar plus weather climate disasters. They certainly run the gamut. And, one of the interesting things that here, I live in the Southeast, we tend to be the bullseye, at least last year, at least for many of these events because of all of the hurricanes that we receive. But clearly up into the regions that you all are dealing with, there's the West Central drought and heat wave of summer, fall 2020, the derecho event and various other things that certainly would impact your region as well. But I often joke, and I'm sure it's not a prize we want to win, but here in the Southeast, we get essentially every single type of extreme weather event that you could get. I don't know that you guys can get hurricanes in that region. I think you can get remnants of the inland storms and the extratropical transition. So you can perhaps make that claim as well. One of the things that I've increasingly been thinking about as I think about this environmental or climate justice lens is this idea of risk and vulnerability. I've published some work in the last 5 years for Georgia looking at climate vulnerability and recently for the United States, which I'll touch on in a moment. And when we think about climate and extreme weather, the hazards are the actual weather climate events themselves, whether it's an urban heat island extreme heat event or a hurricane or a tornado. The exposure is everyone. And that's an important point to understand. When you think about Hurricane Katrina, Katrina itself was the hazard, and everyone along the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans region was exposed to the event. However, because of socioeconomic factors, certain people were more sensitive and vulnerable to that exposure. And there are certain people within that geographic area that have higher resilience or adaptive capacity. And so, for example, I don't live in New Orleans, but if I did, I would have likely had the economic means to go to Atlanta and stay in a hotel for 2 weeks if I needed to, or I probably had adequate insurance on my property if it was damaged. Those are measures of resilience or adaptive capacity. But if you look at the people that were staring at us in the cameras at the Superdome, those were high vulnerability populations that did not have those economic means. And so that's what we mean by resilience. And so risk is an interesting combination of hazard exposure, vulnerability, and resilience. And so keep that in the back of your mind as I talk about these environmental or climate justice issues. This is a graphic directly out of the 2018 National Climate Assessment Report. And it simply talks about the communities of people broadly that would be most vulnerable to extreme weather climate events, those that would fall into high sensitivity categories and likely low resilience categories. So communities of color, children, older adults, low income communities. And so again, this is not simply climate and environmental justice issues, not just about race. That's something that people need to understand. It's about economic status. It's about age. It's about many things that sort of go beyond race. Unfortunately, in many cases, many of those older and younger and poorer people fall into communities of color, but it's not exclusively about one particular race or ethnic class. So here's a paper that one of my former doctoral students and I published with social scientists from the USDA's Forest Service back in 2015. We actually developed a climate vulnerability index for every single county in Georgia. And by the way, in Georgia, if you don't know anything about Georgia, we have 159 counties. So we are very county rich. And so what we looked at is the sort of extreme weather climate events in each county based on data that we had. But we also looked at socioeconomic factors of sensitivity and resilience to try to sort of mash that together, if you will, to create this climate vulnerability index. And so what you see for Georgia is that from the 1980s to 2010, the state is much more orange red. That indicates that the entire state has become more climate vulnerable. But then if you look carefully within each county, there are places that highlight or pop out as extremely vulnerable. And one of the things that immediately caught our eye is that many of the urban counties around the Atlanta area, but down in Savannah and Augusta and Macon, popped out as highly vulnerable because of a combination of urban heat and also urban flooding, but also the types of people that live in those counties. But if you look in the coastal communities or even in some of our highly sort of agricultural counties down in the southern part of the state, there are elevated levels of climate vulnerability too, more related to drought and the impacts that it has on populations of people that live in those counties that work in the agricultural sector that get shuttered from going into the fields, or their jobs are impacted when there's drought. So the point here is that climate vulnerability at the county level varies as a function of the types of hazards, but also as a function of the geography of the state. So there's not one sort of smoking gun, if you will, for what sort of illuminates vulnerability in a particular county. Last year, we published this paper, Multi-Hazard Climate Risk Projections for the United States. And we tried to project some of that climate risk out to the year 2040 using CMIP data, other model projections, and projections of socioeconomic status at counties around the nation. And so, for example, this is a look at sort of the hazard index in the 2040s in terms of anomalies in temperature, precipitation, and extremes of events, as we talk about in that paper. And you can certainly see the paper for the methods that we use. And so you can clearly see in your region, even in my region and so forth, there are areas of sort of expected increased hazards. And again, this hazard index is kind of a mashup of all of these sort of thermal and precipitation anomalies that the models project in the 2040s. They do cluster in some ways, and there's some questions about why that is, but it may be a data resolution modeling issue. So that's the hazard perspective. And then here is the vulnerability perspective in these places. And so if you look in the South, I'll focus on the South first, you can clearly see what to me pops out as what we call here in the Southeast, the Black Belt, the counties where there are significant African-American and likely now Hispanic populations as well. And so because of the wealth or economic gap, these areas are going to sort of illuminate as high vulnerability areas as well. As you come up into your regions, probably some of these urban counties are lighting up as vulnerable, but also some of the rural counties, the farm drought sort of vulnerable counties as well, as I think about people that may be on this call. So this is how we think about and project climate vulnerability. And this comes down to something that I call the weather climate gap. A disproportionate sensitivity to extreme weather climate events and a delay in the ability to bounce back from those events. That's what I just essentially spent the first couple of slides talking about. Everyone in your areas, in your counties, in your state are exposed to a derecho or a drought, or perhaps a flood associated with an MCC, a mesoscale convective complex. Everyone's exposed to the hazards there, But within those communities, within those areas, there are certain people that are disproportionately sensitive and perhaps don't have the means to bounce back. So that's what we mean when we talk about the weather and climate gap. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's not rocket science, even though I used to work at NASA. It boils down to the economic gap. The weather climate gap is directly related to the economic gap. It's not just about climate vulnerability, though. I threw this in because this is something that a student at Jack Sillin at Cornell recently tweeted, and I took this and wrote a Forbes article about it. This was an interesting analysis showing that in the South, some of the radar, I don't want to call them gaps, but sort of reductions in coverage because of overlap issues. Many of the African-American counties of the South are sort of predisposed or disproportionately in many of those radar gaps. And so from a climate perspective, but even an extreme weather meteorological perspective, there are some challenges. And so this is all a part of this, again, justice discussion. Again, I'm focusing on African Americans because I'm African American and it's just data that I have, but I certainly could look at this from the perspective of poor poverty or from Hispanic and so forth. And you heard me mention, let me see, you heard me mention earlier that I believe environmental and climate justice are slightly different. Environmental justice to me, and again, we can quibble on this, we can debate it, is really this idea that certain communities, certain populations and areas are predisposed to corporate hazard through waste dumps, methane facilities, factories and facilities that are polluting or have toxic chemicals and so forth. And so, the environmental justice movement sort of emerged out of this idea that there were certainly communities and people experiencing health disparities and so forth because companies were coming in and putting a chemical factory right in their backyard because that land was cheap, or even more sinister reasons, frankly, or placing a landfill right near a poor community, poor Hispanic community. Or if you go down in the Galveston area, many of those refineries are in poor communities of color. That to me is environmental justice. Climate justice to me is this idea that a hurricane comes through Florence, South Carolina, or Wilmington, North Carolina, and there are certain people that are disproportionately impacted by that weather climate event simply because of their economic status or where they live. And again, that's very much related to environmental justice, and perhaps it's a subset, but I really think of climate and extreme weather justice as sort of a different type of animal in some ways. But again, that's my framing. I mean, but at the end of the day, there's significant problems and we know the root causes of them. So, this is Bob Bullard, who I cite here, is considered by many the founder and godfather of the environmental justice movement. And he, in speaking of African Americans, said 55% of African Americans live in the South. And as I mentioned earlier, the South is prone to more climate related disasters in both scale and magnitude by a ratio of almost 4-1. Now, as I think about some of your communities, if I look at this area, again, not a significant African-American population, except really, if I were to really bore into this, those are probably mostly urban areas. But I suspect that there are large poor communities, Native American communities, and perhaps even increasingly Hispanic communities in these areas too, if we were to look at this map from those perspectives that represent vulnerability as well. So I mentioned Hurricane Katrina earlier. This is an article from 2016. Hurricane Katrina was in 2005. White New Orleans has recovered from Hurricane Katrina. African-American or Black New Orleans hasn't. A full 11 years later, similar Hurricane Harvey, a year after Hurricane Harvey, Houston's poorest neighborhoods are slowest to recover. So when we're thinking about these weather, climate, or environmental justice issues, one of the sort of lessons that I hope that you take away from this discussion is that there's the immediate impact associated with the extreme weather climate event, the drought, the derecho, the flood, the heat wave. But typically, because of the lack of ability or high sensitivity, low adaptive capacity, many of these communities suffer for years. because of these extreme weather climate events. This is some research that came out of my group. One of my former students who's now faculty member at University of Texas, San Antonio, who found that in the Charlotte to Atlanta region, we call it Charlanta, this mega region that's emerging along the Interstate 85 corridor, African-American populations and actually Hispanic, are more likely at a fairly high percentage to live in flood zones, particularly 500-year flood zones. So again, my point here is there is emerging literature in the scientific sort of community on aspects of this problem. It's not, you're seeing a lot right now about the urban heat island and redlining and disparities in heat exposure in cities, but there's increasingly studies coming out focused on these issues as it relates to flooding and tornadoes and so forth as well. So there's Robert Bullard, and this is kind of the classic. I like to show this because Bob Bullard, by the way, if you've never heard him speak, find one of his talks on YouTube or out there in social media. He's an amazing speaker, and he's kind of really candid about things. And he says environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations. Today, zip code is still the most potent predictor of an individual's health and well-being. I think that's a powerful set of statements. But I also think that definition of environmental justice explains why I believe climate justice is a little bit different, because I think that there are just some nuances of the two that sort of are different. So how do we close these gaps, whatever we call them, whether we call them environmental justice gaps or climate justice gaps or the weather climate gap that I call it? First of all, we got to reduce emissions and increase adaptation. That's the sort of uber solution for the climate change problem. We've got to erode the income gaps that exist between certain groups and communities, because that will sort of change the equation when we talk about resiliency or adaptive capacity. But when we ensure that there are mitigation and adaptation and other policies, we have to make sure that they're not being done on the backs of the most vulnerable within our communities. What I mean by that is that, for example, in Miami, there are people now that are fleeing low-lying coastal communities because they recognize that sea level rise is a problem. But they're fleeing further inland into poor communities inhabited by Hispanic and poor and African-American communities. And they're essentially pushing those people out of places they've lived for decades. It's essentially kind of a climate gentrification happening. And so we have to make sure that as we think about these things, we don't do it on the backs of others. We've got to continue to educate marginal populations about vulnerabilities, and we have to increase climate literacy in general. So, just some broad recommendations that I gave there. I wrote a Forbes article actually just last week, and it was really kind of focused on equity and weather warnings. But some of these recommendations are very much related to some of the things that I just talked about too. We've got to address the root cause of disproportionate vulnerability and lack of resiliency, and that essentially comes down to the economic gap. We have to, and I know it's difficult, and I know it's, people like the past is the past, but we have to understand the impact of historical discrimination, segregation, redlining, putting native on reservations, and other systemic challenges that force certain groups of people into geographic spaces that are more vulnerable to weather climate extremes. We have to understand those within the context to understand that these people just aren't poor or lazy or not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, as some often lecture certain groups about. But there are systemic and fundamental reasons why people come in and put a factory where they do, or certain communities live in flood-prone regions. We have to understand that. We have to apply equity and justice filters to any policy, methodology, or project designed for weather, climate warnings, mitigation, and so forth. And this is very important. And I know many of you understand this because you work in extension. It's important to co-produce knowledge. And what I mean by that is I talk to communities all the time, and they're tired of academics and government agencies and so forth coming into their communities, studying them for 3 years until their grant ends, or coming in and poking and prodding them, putting them through focus groups, surveys, et cetera, and then leave, or tell them, here's what you need to do. we have to co-produce knowledge. There has to be buy-in, and equal input from communities, whether it be a poor African-American community in Chicago, or whether it be a Native American community out on the Pine Ridge Reservation, or whether it's a Hispanic community in a part of Nebraska. And so it's important that we all understand and adopt these co-production of knowledge frameworks. And I know extension it has always kind of been sort of on the ground and within the communities. I think the sort of other parts of the academic community need to learn that. So with that, let's talk about some cupcakes. And I'm going to shift my discussion now to climate and weather communication. And I like to start with this meme that Brad Panovich, a TV meteorologist in Charlotte, North Carolina, tweeted one time, trying to help people understand the difference between tornado watch and warning, because people still confuse those, perhaps not in the part of the world that you all live in, but in places perhaps that don't receive tornadoes as often. And he's like, look, there are the ingredients for cupcake. That's cupcake watch. There's cupcake. That's cupcake warning. I think this is one of the best ways to sort of really convey the difference between watches and warnings. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful example of science communication. And so what I want to do now is offer some tips for communication science to people who are not scientists and who are on social media. And there you see me in my classroom at the University of Georgia, and there you see me talking to Ricky Rude on one of the television episodes of Weather Geeks. I am an academic that very much believes in getting out of the ivory tower, because as you see, and this is something that I said in a magazine several years ago, I believe that too many scientists are comfortable in the ivory tower and journal space and conferences. However, a gale of misinformation rushes in to replace the void if scientists are not communicating to the public, stakeholders, and students. And so I think we have to get out of this ivory tower mentality that many of my colleagues have. Now, again, you all are on the front lines of this. You understand this very well. So I'm not necessarily preaching to this choir, but there's a choir of colleagues that I deal with all the time that say things like, oh, I don't use that Twitter stuff, that new stuff like Twitter. And I'm like looking at them like, newsflash, it's not new. It's been around a while. And so we've got to get out of that mentality and this idea of popularizers. Look, by any metric that you can look at for me academically, I check off all the boxes. I lead my department and publish journal articles each year and grant money and so forth. But I still do Twitter and Instagram and write for Forbes and go on the Weather Channel. So this idea that academics are people that sort of have their day jobs, can't do these other things, or they consider them extra things, I frown upon that narrative. And this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this guy right here. We're dealing with some guy on Twitter that just told this poor guy with all this expertise that he's wrong. That's what we're dealing with. We're in an era of people thinking they have degrees from Wikipedia University, Blog State University, Twitter Institute of Technology, Twitter Tech for short. This is the world that we're in. People consume information from blogs, from social media, from their cousin on Facebook who saw some video on YouTube. And so we have to counterattack the big challenges. The Dunning-Kruger effect, this idea that, that's the Dunning-Kruger effect is this psychological sort of construct from two Cornell scientists that basically says people think they know more about subjects than they do, or they underestimate what they don't know. That's what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. There are many other cognitive dissonances out there as well that shape people. And by the way, if you really want to go more information on this, I invite you to take a look at my TED Talk on the 3 biases that shape people's views on science. If you just do a quick Google of my name and 3 biases and TED Talk, you'll find it. And I talk in detail about these. Confirmation bias is something else that I talk about. People consume information that is already consistent with what they believe or think. So they go to certain sources or websites or media outlets. And then, of course, the sort of wild, wild west that is the internet and social media. So I just kind of defined this Dunning-Kruger effect. So I answered that question. In terms of cognitive dissonances, there are all kinds of things out there. There was a Nature climate change study that found that people with increased scientific literacy are actually better at fitting evidence to their own narratives, ideologies, or cultural perspectives. And I'm curious how many of you have encountered that. People that are, you would consider, college educated or very intelligent or reasonable people. Sometimes they have the wackiest views on climate change, for example, or COVID. And that's because they're, from this study, they're better at taking evidence and shaping it to sound good, but be, fundamentally flawed. And so just be aware of that, because I'm sure you might have some audiences that you deal with that kind of apply some of these cognitive dissonances and biases. So, for example, from a perception standpoint, most people think that I encounter think that the greatest cause of deaths from weather each year is tornadoes or hurricanes. But in fact, we all know that it's heat and floods, or cold, extreme temperatures and floods. So people have these perceptions about that, and then it shapes their viewpoints. And so I like to have fun with this slide. People think heat lightning is a thing. I get that all the time in the South. I recently wrote something in Forbes sort of dispelling that myth of heat lightning. People don't believe it gets cold in deserts. They think hurricanes and typhoons are somehow fundamentally different storms. Many of us that have meteorology degrees have heard, weather forecasters are wrong all of the time. That's a myth. People think, contrails or chemtrails. People think the polar vortex is the Arctic hurricane coming to get us. And so there are all of these sort of weather and climate perception issues that we already deal with as weather and climate professionals. And then on top of that, we've got all of those cognitive dissonances and biases and so forth. So the first tip I would say is, in terms of communicating science, is know your audience. Someone told me on Weather Geeks one time, if you don't know your audience, it's like throwing darts at a dartboard with the lights off. And so what I mean by that is, when I go out and talk sea level rise, this is a road that connects Savannah to Tybee Island. It flooded like this due to a king tide several years ago. People said they'd never seen anything like it. So I might use this if I'm talking to residents at a local Rotary Club meeting on Tybee Island in Georgia. I might show this at an AGU or an AMS conference, satellite data, and this SOVI index of vulnerability along coastal, I might use that at a testimony before Congress. So again, same essential message, but conveyed in a completely different way because of the differences in audiences. Number two, avoid jargon. We are, as science communities, terrible oftentimes at throwing words around that are meaningful to us in our communities, but have completely different meanings to the public, or perhaps even a policymaker or a stakeholder. So for example, the word bias, in the science world, offset from an observation. Look, that thermometer has a 2-degree warm bias, but to the public, it might sound like something distorted or a political motive. Positive trend. Positive to many people sounds like something that's good, that's supposed to happen, right? But if I said there's a positive trend in carbon dioxide, we know that that's bad, positive trend in our atmosphere. And so just be very careful and cognizant of those jargony words. Now, here's one that if any of you have ever been to graduate school, you understand. We teach you in graduate school the fundamentally wrong way to communicate to the public and policymakers. What I mean by that is, if you look at this triangle on the left, this is basically how you're taught to do your master's thesis or your dissertation. You do these 200 word dissertations with all this background supporting the details and methodology. Results come at the end of the 300 pages. Or you give a 1-hour talk with all the background and so forth, and then at the end, you actually give them the results. Let me give me 1 second here. I'm going to actually switch over to my. Okay, hopefully you can still hear me. I switched on to my microphone so that I wouldn't disturb my family who just made it home. Really, the right way to do this is to actually use when you're talking to the public at least, is to use the triangle on the right. You've got to get right to the bottom line right up front. You don't need to worry about all the background and details that you're taught to do in an academic setting. And so this is a fundamental different way of thinking about communicating. Number 4, I'm a big fan of using analogies and metaphors. Many people often know me for saying that weather is your mood and climate is your personality. I often say that when I see someone tweet or question global warming because it's cold where they live that day or because it's snowing. If your mood today doesn't define your personality, and so we have to, use analogies and metaphors to our advantage. Use 3 points in the 3 M's. This is also very important, even though I'm violating it today because I have 9 tips. But research shows that people remember things in threes. And so by putting things in 3 meaningful points, it can resonate with the public. And also the 3 M's: keep your points miniature, meaningful, and memorable. These are just tricks of the trade that I find to have value when you're trying to communicate broadly to the public or a policymaker or a stakeholder. Number 6, always remember that you are the expert. Now, in weather and climate world, I know you all resonate with this. We have a lot of competitors. There are some people that swear by the Farmer's Almanac. There's some people that swear by their aching knee. There's some people that will only listen to their favorite TV meteorologist and so forth. And so people have these sort of varying experiences with their expert knowledge base when it comes to weather and climate. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about things like climate or derechos or tsunamis, even if you're not necessarily a card carrying expert in that particular topical matter, it's likely that you're more of an expert than the people that you're talking to. So you get comfortable in that. Use social media, and this is a somewhat old graphic now, but it still makes the point. The vast majority of people get their science information now from the internet, not television or newspapers. And so we have to be in those spaces. We have to be there in order to sort of convey information to these people because that's where they're getting their science. So I'm actually giving a little homework assignment. I'm a professor, so I can't do a talk without giving homework, right? I'm not saying for you to do this right now, but take stock of your own use of social media as a professional. Jot down what you perceive as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of social media from your perspective. This is called a SWOT analysis. Many of you are probably familiar with it. I challenge you at some point in the day or perhaps in the week to do this analysis and see how you can up your social media game or enhance it in some way. Number 8, and I mentioned this earlier, we've got to get over this idea. There was this sort of thing that propagated or in academia that, oh, scientists that talk to the media or that do TV shows or this and that, or like Neil deGrasse, they're popularizers. They're not serious scientists. Well, I just got elected to the National Academy of Sciences, but I do all of those things. So I shattered this myth that you can't do both. And I completely sort of recommend that we kind of move beyond that sort of notion. And I think we're slowly getting there. And then the ninth thing is relate. There was a fellow, and I can't remember his name. I think it was Steve McNulty here at the Southeast Climate Center or at NC State. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's a USDA organization that stood up a few years ago. And he came down to the University of Georgia, Steve, and he mentioned this thing called Elfland. And I just thought it was the most wonderful acronym, Elfland. Establish contact. You go to a community of farmers that may be skeptical about the validity of climate change. You don't go in there with your trend lines and fancy academic titles and papers and so forth. You go to that community and you establish contact. You listen to them. What are they observing on their farm? What are their perspectives on drought or what they're noticing about precipitation changes and so forth? And then once you establish contact and listen, you can find common ground. And then you sort of build that trust and that common ground and sort of see that you have maybe some similar values that you're trying to sort of understand. And that lessens mistrust. And then once you lessen that mistrust and you've kind of shattered or sort of obliterated that perceived boundary between the two, you can start to assess needs, nurture, and deliver. And so I thought that just keeping this Elfland acronym in the back of our minds can be a really useful way to frame our discussions on climate change, and so forth. So I want to end now with just some of the some broad thinking that I have about where I think we're headed. I think there's optimism right now in the climate community. Science is respected again. Uh, there's climate across the agencies and disciplines now. Now, this can help with some of the justice and equity issues that was talking about earlier. So, what I mean by that, and I've been privy to some of these conversations. That, frankly, I was approached by the Biden administration about serving in his administration, but wasn't ready to do that for various reasons right now. But I'm still very much in the conversations. In fact, as soon as I get off of this call today, I'm jumping on a high level NOAA call on some of these very issues. Um, but climate is not just in NOAA and NASA and EPA or DOE or USDA. You're starting to see Department of Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, and others talk about and think about climate issues from their perspectives. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because that really gets at the so what of climate changes and takes it out of this sort of academic or sort of untouchable perspective that many people in the public see it as. We're back in the Paris Agreement. That's good. Now, the Green New Deal, it's very controversial, and I don't really, frankly, know much about it as well. But I do know this. I think that we're going to increasingly see movement into renewable energy sources. I think many of your areas are well suited with wind power and agriculture and ethanol and so forth to kind of be major players in this respect. Uh, and clearly, the new infrastructure plan that's being talked about right now is a stealth climate plan, and because clearly there are ties between our infrastructure and climate as well. So that's where I wanted to end the discussion, and hopefully we can now just have a conversation and have some questions, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much for your ear.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shepard, for that insightful talk. I was going in between here and Twitter. Everybody will see a poll coming up here. Please fill that out as you can. As I was mentioning, I was going between Twitter and trying to get as much stuff as possible out while you're talking. There's really a lot of information in there. It was really great. So for our audience, we have a good amount of time for questions. And so please, if you have a question for Dr. Shepard, please either use the Q&A option there at the bottom. I saw Kenny has already put something in there, or post a message to the chat. We'll get it up to Dr. Shepard. So Dr. Shepard, Kenny Blumenfeld from Minnesota asked, regarding climate justice and equity in the U.S., what trends or opportunities give you the most hope? Kind of sort of building on your final slide there, what sort of thing give you the most hope for the future?
Oh, well, thank you for the question, and thank you, Mark, for those kind words. Kenny, I know Kenny very well. Good to hear from you, Kenny, and to see that you're on this. Kenny and I actually have had some mutual interest in some of the urban climate work that I've done in the past. So always good to hear from Kenny. I think in terms of trends or opportunities, things that give me hope, I think one of them is what I just mentioned in that final slide, the fact that the current thinking is to sort of embed policy in terms of climate just beyond the science agencies. In other words, I think that you're going to see health and human services policy, housing and urban development policy, transportation policy that is fundamentally thinking about climate impacts, climate resiliency, climate equity issues. That's something new in the federal policy space. And I think, irrespective of previous administrations, Democratic or Republican, I think I'm seeing a fundamental shift at the federal level. Something else that gives me hope also is that even in the midst of some of the bleakest times over the past several years in terms of climate policy, us pulling out of the Paris Agreement and the attack on the EPA and so forth, I saw so much activity in local and state organizations within cities or within states or with NGOs, even within faith-based organizations that gave me so much hope and inspiration. I'm always inspired and hopeful because the youth, irrespective of their political leanings, their faith perspectives, or where they come from, tend to get it on these issues. And so I think we're seeing an erosion of the I mean, some of you may be familiar with the Six America study that Yale and George Mason does, and where they query every year America on their views on various aspects of climate change. You're seeing an erosion of the category, which was called the dismissive category. That number was as high as about 13% several years ago. It's down to about, I think, 7% now. It's going to always be a small pocket, and that's usually the person you're yelling at on Twitter that's giving you some weird wacky theory at Thanksgiving dinner that they heard from their uncle. But that dismissive category is declining, and so that's hopeful as well. And I'm happy to see this discussion about equity and justice. It's not playing any kind of race cards or poverty cards. It's just the reality of the fact that the most vulnerable in our society, no matter what color they are, or what they look like, or who they worship, or who they love, are at greatest vulnerability from this next generation of weather climate events that we're going to experience. And so it's just the moral thing to do. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the question and answer now heating up. So Mark Megalos asked, how did you get your communication chops?
Yeah.
And if you don't mind, if I can integrate a question in there as well, kind of the same idea for folks that are climate experts, but maybe not experts in communication, or on the flip side, are regularly engaging with stakeholders, but aren't necessarily climate experts, sort of recommendations, kind of first steps to really start that process.
Yeah. Well, thank you for both of those questions. And thank you again, Mark. So, to some degree, one of the things I spent 12 years of my career at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center as a scientist. And if you know anything about NASA as compared to other federal agencies, they actually think carefully about communication and outreach. They don't see it as a byproduct or just something they have to do. It's fundamentally a part of what they do. They have their own television station, for goodness sake, NASA TV. And as a scientist, young scientist there, I actually was given the opportunity to take a media training course. So I learned some really interesting things about media training and communication from taking that course. Even in college, I was always like president of my fraternity or president of senior class at Florida State during my graduating year. And I took a speech class and so forth. So I always sort of took classes and had a knack for speaking in public and those types of things. And I often get this question. People say, well, everyone's not going to have your personality or some of your public speaking skills, but you might not, but I bet some of you can write. So start a blog or go out there on social media. And I guess my point there is we may all have slightly different skill sets, but there's probably something that can leverage one of your solid skill sets. I would also recommend, and I'll get to sort of your question, other part of the question, Trent. If you haven't read the book by Dave Schultz called Eloquent Science, I would highly recommend that book. Dave Schultz is also a very amazing scholar and meteorology climate expert. He wrote the book Eloquent Science to convey the best practices for communicating science. I would also recommend my Forbes article there's a Forbes version of that last part of the talk, 9 tips for communicating science to non-scientists. There's an article out there that I wrote that kind of really highlights much of what I just said. So I would recommend that as well. On the sort of becoming a climate expert side of the house, there are a couple of resources I always recommend. One is a book by Bob Henson called The Thinking Person's Guide to Climate Change. I think that's just a very good 101 book that can bring anyone up to speed on the basic things they need to know about the climate science, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, but he writes it in a very accessible way. Mike Nelson, who's a TV meteorologist in the Denver market, also has written a very small, short, accessible book that I also recommend. And then I always just recommend the resources at climate.gov, which is NOAA's climate website. I think they have a lot of really good information. Now, on the mitigation and adaptation side, I'm actually a PI on an effort called Drawdown Georgia, which is looking at the various ways to kind of draw down carbon emissions. And it's a spinoff of the broader Project Drawdown project. So I would actually also recommend both of those efforts as well, if you're more interested in sort of the emission reduction and sort of what do we do about it side of the house.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, Eloquent Science is actually one of my recommended readings for starting graduate students. It's a great way to start out.
It is.
So Allison Van Pelt asked about metrics to analyze adaptive capacity and the sort of metrics that you like to use to assess that.
Yeah, well, in those papers that I mentioned that we published, the Casey et al. 2015 and Casey et al. 2020, we're looking at things like availability and access to hospitals, the number of homes with air conditioning or without air conditioning, the insured populations, insurance of and things that can sort of give you an indication of resilience to various extreme weather factors, whether it be a flood or a heat wave and so forth. I mean, how many people don't have health insurance in a county, for example, is a metric of adaptive capacity. Or how many people live within a certain radius of hospitals. That's another. So there are these sort of metrics that if you think about them, they really give you an indication of a community's ability to withstand or weather, pun intended, a particular hazard.
And I'm going to combine two questions here, two for one. So Virgil Schmidt asked, what can be done to elevate vulnerable populations representation and policy making, especially policies related to mitigation. And then, Paul asked the kind of the path to follow for communicating in a similar way to reach policymakers. So both to reach policymakers with information, but also elevating the voices of those most vulnerable to climate change and strategies in doing that.
Yeah, well, the seat at the table is important for elevating those voices. So, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a professor, and he's a friend of mine named Dr. Vernon Morris. He's now at Arizona State, but he used to be at Howard University. He actually, in a talk at AMS earlier in the year, said an African American is actually statistically more likely to become the president of the United States than become an atmospheric sciences professor, tenured professor at a university. And that was a really provocative statement, and he had the data to back it up. But I think his point, candidly, I know all 5 or 6 of the tenured African American professors in that major atmospheric sciences programs in this nation. The student population of Hispanic, African American, and Native American within the AMS, because I was president of AMS, so I know the numbers. For African Americans, it's about 2%. For Hispanic, it's about 1%. And for Native American is much less than 1%. And so representation matters for those voices. But here's the good news. When we're talking about climate equity, mitigation, the people at the table don't just have to be PhD scientists or scientists in academia. There are so many tentacles to this discussion now that are beyond the climate science and mitigation space, energy policy, housing. Heck, I spoke last year during the pandemic by Zoom to the National Fair Housing Alliance Council because they were thinking about climate from perspective of fair housing. So representation and voices at the table is very important. But then again, I think we, I know I'm talking to folks that really think a lot about extension services. I think we need an extension model that, in terms of how you all do your business, immersive model within the communities or within groups. I think we need that in the academic side of the house. I was talking earlier in the discussion about sort of the, just with some of the panelists about how, like at University of Georgia, for example, the extension services, they live in the part of the university called public service and outreach. And so they have a significant focus, whereas a lot of the expertise in climate science, the sort of scientists, ivory tower folks, we are in sort of the College of Engineering or the College of Arts and Sciences. And we aren't enabled or incentivized to do things in the public or to testify before Congress. At the end of the day, in the world that I live in, the metric for success is how many papers did you publish, how many grants did you get, and to some degree, what are your teaching evaluations? That's it. You're not. And so there are a lot of young scholars, and this is something I rail about as well. There are a lot of young academics, young assistant professors that are not incentivized to testify before Congress or write Forbes articles or go talk to the Rotary Club because they're dug into their labs trying to get papers out and get funded grants. And so we have to fundamentally change our incentive structure and the academic mentality in order to make sure that at least people in those sectors are doing what, in many cases, a lot of the folks on the extension side are already doing.
Yeah, thank you again. We just have a few more questions. And I think this is just a representation of how great of a talk this was. There's so much interest in the Q&A.
Sure.
So there a specific question from Kevin and also Brittany kind of adding her question onto here as well. So, communication techniques and suggestions, especially, thinking about when communicating with folks that respond to what we can maybe consider an objective assessment of climate change with something that is maybe a bit out there. So the example Kevin used was forest fires caused by space lasers and things like that. And so, so a specific, thinking about strategies that to kind of get discussions back on track without offending or off-putting the person who may be coming from a good faith place.
Yeah, I mean, just some of the sort of more wacky things that I hear out there. I mean, you just have to almost not give it any airtime. One of the things that I don't do, for example, on Twitter, I can always see when someone's trying to provoke me into a sort of what I call a Twitter tennis match, just going back and forth. I don't really engage. I mean, now if I see someone's legitimately asking reasonable questions and understanding and maybe just are misinformed on things, I'm certainly happy to engage. But if someone approached me with space lasers, I just wouldn't even give it the time of day, because if I do, it gives it credibility. And they're like, "Oh, look, he responded," and they know it kind of. So I think there's sort of, you just have to sort of develop a callus thumb on your thumb for those of you that play golf or sports, and sort of just to some of that stuff. And you also have to develop a filter to some that just really maybe are just misinformed, or at least open to sort of a dialogue. So I'm always respectful and I always respond and try to lay out the facts, but there are some nuance. You've got to develop a sense of who's really being legitimate and honest, and want to know, improve their understanding, versus someone that has an agenda or that's trying to antagonize you. And so, I don't really respond much to those folks.
All right, we got two more questions. Real quick, is there, Joe Stokes had asked, is there an example of an academic institution or government agency that really exemplifies a strong social media presence for science communication that you had discussed, like any really good follows on Twitter, for example, that set a good precedent?
Yeah, there are too many for me to give in this format. For example, I love the NASA Earth Observatory website. I think on Twitter it's just at NASA Earth. I think they do a really good job. Catherine Hayhoe, actually, if you just go to her Twitter and find, she has compiled a list of the top sort of climate follows out there. And there's some really good organizations on that list. You just find her list. It's like about 3,000 people on it, but there's some really good follows there as well that I recommend. But I think NASA's sites do a good job. That climate.gov site from NOAA that I mentioned does a really good job as well. I mean, it's a really tough question. There are some really good ones out there. I think I don't know if it's on social media. I'm sure they are, but again, the Yale Climate Communication folks, the George Mason group, they're really good as well. And actually, the Berkeley group as well, actually, which is interesting, that group really stood up initially to sort of disprove the idea that climate change was happening global anthropogenic, and sort of they kind of reversed course once they started looking at the data. So Robert Rodell and then the folks at that organization are pretty good too.
So a couple other questions. I just keep seeing them pop up. This is great. Thank you for your questions from the audience here. So Juliet asked, to hear the thoughts on mentoring the next generation of scientists and educators. You know this a little bit with kind of a generational shift in perspectives on climate and climate change. Mm-hmm. How do we get scientists to see their work through a lens of climate justice? And then also Juliet asked about how you came to this profession, what kind of led you to this, as well as focusing on some of the topics that you discussed in the talk today.
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I don't really do a lot of climate justice work myself. Those couple of papers. I mean, most of my research is really in areas of hydroclimatic extremes, urban climate, some risk and vulnerability work. So, if you go and look at my paper trail of peer-reviewed publication, it's going to be kind of really in the traditional sort of hard science, physical, meteorological, hydrometeorological processes world. But, the good thing about being a professor is you have students that want to work with you, and they have all kinds of really interesting topics. So, if you've heard of the brown ocean concept, for example, of hurricanes re-intensifying or maintaining their intensity over land, that came from my research group at UGA. I'm fairly known for a lot of the work I've done on urban effects on initiation and maintenance of storms, precipitation, convection, and so forth, and other aspects of hurricane work as well. But this work that I've recently in the last 10 years been dabbling with climate risk and vulnerability, was of interest to me because I'm an African American scientist who grew up in a modest community in Canton, Georgia, just a small community 40 miles north of Atlanta. And so, just seeing how disconnected probably many people in my community are from some of this, they probably like, well, I got to worry about my light bill, or how am I going to pay for groceries? That stuff about polar bears in the year 2020 doesn't matter. 2100 doesn't matter to me. What it actually does, because the cost of your cereal, the price of gas, your son's health care, all are very much tied to many of these issues that we're talking about. So, that's what I call the so what factors, the kitchen table issues. We have to, really be attuned to as scholars in this space. I've written on that as well. And again, if you haven't checked out some of my Forbes writing, I write about a lot of these issues. I'm fairly prolific because I always wake up in the morning with ideas, and so I just tend to write them. I just, in terms of how I got into this, ironically, I just told this story yesterday because the University of Georgia had a reception for the three of us that were elected into the National Academy of Sciences this year at UGA. And I was up giving my remarks. I said, ironically, the reason I'm standing here right now is because of a honeybee, believe it or not, because I wanted to be an entomologist. I used to, as a young kid, be out in the yard catching honeybees in jars and mason jars and putting grass in them and just kind of staring at what they do all day. Because I was an only child of a single parent mom who was an educator. So I had a lot of time on my hands as an only child. So I did that kind of stuff. But I got stung by one and found out I was highly allergic to bee stings. And that was in the years before EpiPens. So I was like, sixth grade science project rolled around. I was, well, I need a plan B, pun intended. And so that's when I discovered, that I can make little weather instruments. I just saw something about how to make your own weather instruments. So I made the weather instruments, started taking weather measurements around my home in Cherokee County. And so my sixth grade science project was, can a sixth grader predict the weather? And I won the science fair and went on the district and placed there as well. And so from that point on, I was literally bitten by the weather bug, I guess you could say. And so I always knew that I didn't want to be a TV meteorologist on air, like saying, hey, the cold front's moving in. That's just what never interested me. I was always more interested in the how and why. So I started researching schools. Florida State was somewhat close to Georgia. At the time, Georgia Tech nor University of Georgia had undergraduate programs in atmospheric sciences. So Florida State was close, and it was a really good program. And so that's kind of how I ended up there, ended up staying on and getting a master's degree. I worked for a couple of years and then went back to do my doctorate at Florida State, and then started my career at NASA as a research scientist there. And then 2005, 2006, moved to the University of Georgia.
That's serendipitous.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take a risk and open it up to Dennis Toddy, who has a live question.
Okay.
So go ahead, Dennis.
No risk involved. Okay, I'm going to use your 3 number. Can you give people an extension, or people who are facing the public and want to work with underserved communities, 2 or 3 practical first steps down that path?
Sure. So I'll give 3. I'm going to take my own advice and give 3. The first step is be humble. Second step is find a value system that connects. And then the third step is assure or establish that there will be sustainability. So be humble. Yeah, we're all coming in with our degrees and coming in with things that we know and probably have an idea of what we think should happen. But co-production of knowledge that I mentioned is very important. So that idea of being humble is just really this notion of being willing to establish a sort of a community ground up approach to understanding and dealing with those communities. I think that is very important. And then that last point I mentioned also is very important also, because when working with these communities, the second point was finding and connecting with their values, understand what their value systems are. That's very important when you're working with such groups. And then the third thing is, don't leave them high and dry. Have a sustainable plan with that community.
All right. Well, thank you again. I'm going to end it here with one last question. So Thomas, thank you for sticking with us here since this is last right at the beginning. So the timing of mitigation adaptation, Thomas Mace asks, will we win that foot race? Is there enough time to do what we need to do and from a mitigation adaptation standpoint to avoid the largest impacts?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that, I mentioned Project Drawdown earlier, and Drawdown Georgia, which really are areas more in the mitigation space, trying to reduce carbon emissions. I think we're going to have a selective mix of policy that addresses both, because, as they say, the house is already burning. So, we can think about sort of putting in, some measures to mitigate future houses, but we've got to deal with the issue now of that house burning. And so I think we're going to have some some adaptation strategies in terms of, agricultural practices, perhaps seawalls, various places, the types of things we've seen in Northern Europe, that perhaps in certain hurricane prone communities. I think those are the kind of discussions that need to be had in this part of this infrastructure conversation that's going on right now. I think there's beginning to be an appetite towards real discussions about carbon taxation, which is a mitigation strategy and so forth. Now, I'm not advocating for more taxes, but I think we're getting to a point where those conversations are a bit more politically tractable, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. So I think we've got to have a mixed bag approach. There were times where policy was just either mitigation or adaptation, but I think that now we need to have a little bit of both, and we ultimately are going to shift to a renewable energy economy. That's coming. We aren't going to do it anytime in the next decade or two, and so but I think we've got to be prepared for that transition. So.
I know I said that was the last question, but Julie Dahl keeps asking good ones. So one more for you here. So, thinking about the audience here, and you mentioned the important role of extension before, but what do you think extension can do to better serve communities on the topic of climate?
I think that the ample answer is really simple. I think talk about it and understand and really engage your communities that you deal with as extension. Kind of walk through that Elfland process that I mentioned at the end, and find out where various people that you deal with are on those. And again, you don't necessarily have to come right out and mention climate change, because that will immediately turn some people off. That's one of the things I've learned. But there are ways to talk about these things in a way that you're getting around it in a roundabout way. So I just think, I mentioned something about having a seat at the table early in terms of representation. Climate needs a seat at the table when you're in your dialogues with your constituents.
Great way to wrap it up. So thank you again, Dr. Marshall Shepard, for joining us. Thank you for your great presentation.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm happy to, like I said, I'm out there on Twitter. And I should mention, because I always try to mention, is I wrote a book last year. It's not directly related to this topic, but I wrote a book called The Race Awakening of 2020 after the whole George Floyd incident. But believe it or not, some of the things that I talk about in there will shape some of the things that I just said about equity and climate discussion issues. So if you really want to kind of pick my brain a little bit, that 70-page handbook that I wrote will give you some really insight on what shapes a lot of my perspective on some of these race and equity issues.
Well, thank you very much again. And it was a great pleasure. Good luck with your NOAA meeting after this.
Yeah, that one's going to be a lot more boring than this. This was great. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.